Benjamin Netanyahu is an Israeli politician and diplomat who served as his country's prime minister 3 times, 1996–99, 2009–21, and 2022, and is the longest-serving prime minister since Israel's independence. In 1963 Netanyahu, the son of the historian Benzion Netanyahu, moved with his family to Philadelphia in the United States. After enlisting in the Israeli military in 1967, he became a soldier in the elite Special Operations Unit Sayeret Matkal and was on the team that rescued a hijacked jet plane at the Tel Aviv airport in 1972. He later studied at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MBA, 1976, taking time out to fight in the Yom Kippur War in Israel in 1973. After his brother Jonathan died while leading the successful Entebbe raid in 1976, Benjamin founded the Jonathan Institute, which sponsored conferences on terrorism. Netanyahu held several ambassadorship positions before being elected to the Knesset, Israeli parliament, as a Likud member in 1988. He served as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, 1988–91, and then as a Deputy Minister in Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir's coalition cabinet, 1991–92. In 1993 he easily won election as the leader of the Likud party, succeeding Shamir in that post. Netanyahu became noted for his opposition to the 1993 Israel-PLO peace accords and the resulting Israeli withdrawals from the West Bank and Gaza Strip. First term as Prime Minister, 1996–99. The governing Labour Party entered the 1996 elections with weakened electoral appeal following the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in November 1995 by a Jewish extremist and a series of suicide bombings by Muslim militants early in 1996. Netanyahu eked out a victory margin of about 1% over Prime Minister Shimon Peres in the elections of May 29, 1996, the first in which the Prime Minister was directly elected. Netanyahu became the youngest person ever to serve as Israel's prime minister when he formed a government on June 18. Unrest dominated Netanyahu's first prime ministership. Soon after he entered office, relations with Syria deteriorated, and his decision in September 1996 to open an ancient tunnel near Al-Aqsa Mosque angered Palestinians and sparked intense fighting. Netanyahu then reversed his earlier opposition to the 1993 peace accords and in 1997 agreed to withdraw troops from most of the West Bank town of Hebron. Pressure from within his coalition, however, led Netanyahu to announce his intention to establish a new Jewish settlement on land claimed by the Palestinians. He also significantly lowered the amount of land that would be handed over to the Palestinians during Israel's next phase of withdrawal from the West Bank. Violent protests, including a series of bombings, ensued. In 1998 Netanyahu and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat participated in peace talks that resulted in the Y Memorandum, the terms of which included placing as much as 40% of the West Bank under Palestinian control. The agreement was opposed by right-wing groups in Israel, and several factions in Netanyahu's government coalition quit. In 1998 the Knesset dissolved the government, and new elections were scheduled for May 1999. Netanyahu's re-election campaign was hindered by a fragmented right wing as well as by voters' growing dislike of his inconsistent peace policies and his often abrasive style. In addition, a series of scandals had plagued his administration, including his appointment in 1997 of Ronnie Bar-On, a Likud party functionary, as Attorney General. Allegations that Bar-On would arrange a plea bargain for a Netanyahu ally who had been charged with fraud and bribery led to a series of confidence votes in the Knesset. With his core political support undermined, Netanyahu was easily defeated by Ehud Barak, leader of the Labour Party, in the 1999 elections. Netanyahu was succeeded as head of Likud in 1999 by Ariel Sharon but remained a popular figure in the party. When early elections were called in 2001, Netanyahu, who had resigned his seat in the Knesset and thus was ineligible to run for prime minister, unsuccessfully challenged Sharon for leadership of the party. In Sharon's government, Netanyahu served as foreign minister, 2002-03, and finance minister, 2003, 05. In 2005 Sharon left Likud and formed a centrist party, Kadima. Netanyahu was subsequently elected leader of Likud and was the party's unsuccessful prime ministerial candidate for the 2006 Knesset elections, in which Likud secured only 12 seats to Kadima's 29. Second stint as prime minister, 2009 to 21. The election of February 2009 saw sizable Likud gains as Netanyahu led the party to 27 Knesset seats, finishing a single seat behind Kadima, led by Tzipi Livni. Because of the close and inconclusive nature of the results, however, it was not immediately clear which party's leader would be invited to form a coalition government. Through the course of coalition discussions in the days that followed, Netanyahu gathered the support of Yisrael Beiteinu, 15 seats, Shas, 11 seats, and a number of smaller parties, and he was asked by Israel's president to form the government, which was sworn in on March 31, 2009. In June 2009 Netanyahu for the first time expressed qualified support for the principle of an independent Palestinian state, with the conditions that any future Palestinian state would have to be demilitarized and would have to formally recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Those conditions were quickly rejected by Palestinian leaders. A brief round of negotiations in 2010 broke down when a 10-month partial moratorium on building settlements in the West Bank expired and Israel refused to extend it. The peace process remained at a standstill for the rest of Netanyahu's term. Netanyahu also took a hard line in foreign affairs, lobbying for the international community to take stronger action against Iran's alleged nuclear weapons program, which he described as the greatest threat to Israeli security and world peace. He also expressed pessimistic views regarding a series of popular uprisings and revolutions in the Arab world in 2011 that were collectively referred to as the Arab Spring, predicting that new Arab leaders would be more hostile to Israel than their predecessors. Domestically, Netanyahu faced growing economic discontent among the middle class and the young. In the summer of 2011, large street protests spread throughout Israel, decrying social and economic inequality and calling on the government to increase its support for transportation, education, childcare, housing, and other public services. The following year his coalition was threatened twice by disagreements with coalition partners over military draft exemptions for Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, Jews. The third and final coalition crisis of 2012 led to early elections after the coalition met an impasse over an austerity budget. Elections in January 2013 returned Netanyahu to the post of prime minister, but at the head of a coalition that appeared closer to the political center than his previous one. A reinvigorated center-left had emerged, led by Yesh Atid, a party newly formed by media mogul Yair Lapid that had campaigned on the middle-class socio-economic concerns of the 2011 protests. Meanwhile, a combined list presented by Likud and Yisrael Beiteinu had won the largest number of Knesset seats in 2013 but fell short of expectations. After weeks of negotiations, Netanyahu was able to forge an agreement between the Likud, Yisrael Beiteinu bloc, Lapid's Yesh Atid, Livni's Hatnua party, and several smaller parties. In July 2014 Netanyahu ordered a large-scale military operation in the Gaza Strip in response to rocket fire into Israel. At the end of the 50-day campaign, Netanyahu stated that the objective of significantly damaging militants' capability to fire rockets had been achieved. Internationally, however, the operation was criticized for the high number of Palestinian casualties. By late 2014 serious disagreements had emerged within the governing coalition over budget issues and a controversial bill that would have defined Israel as a Jewish state. In December Netanyahu dismissed Livni and Lapid from the cabinet, triggering early elections set for March 2015. New tension was injected into the relationship between Netanyahu and U.S. President Barack Obama, already strained by disagreements over negotiations with the Palestinians in 2014, when Netanyahu emerged as a vocal critic of the Obama administration's Iran policy, which sought to resolve the Iranian nuclear issue through international negotiations. Netanyahu charged that any compromise would ultimately leave Iran with the option of developing nuclear weapons and that sanctions against Iran should be maintained instead. In January 2015, with Israel's elections approaching, Netanyahu accepted an invitation to address the U.S. Congress regarding Iran, which he did on March 3. The invitation was the source of considerable controversy because it had been issued by the Speaker of the House of Representatives without notifying the White House, a departure from protocol for visiting heads of state, and because Netanyahu was widely expected to voice criticism of the Obama administration. Critics in Israel and the United States charged that, by openly aligning himself with the partisan opponents of a sitting president, Netanyahu was putting the United States' bipartisan support for Israel at risk. As the March 17 election grew closer, analysts predicted that it would be a very close race between Netanyahu's Likud party and the Zionist Union, a center-left alliance comprising the Labour Party and Hatnuah. When results were released, it became clear that Netanyahu and Likud had won the most Knesset seats, 30, followed by the Zionist Union, with 24, in a surprisingly decisive victory. Indictment and coalition troubles. Netanyahu's fourth term took place in the shadow of 4 ongoing investigations into bribery and other forms of corruption allegedly committed by Netanyahu and members of his inner circle. In February 2018, Israeli police announced that they had found sufficient evidence to recommend charges of bribery and fraud in 2 of the cases. In the first case, Netanyahu had allegedly traded political favors for gifts, including expensive cigars, champagne, and jewelry. Likud, Netanyahu's political rival and one-time coalition partner, emerged as a key witness in the case. In the second case, Netanyahu had allegedly sought to secure favorable coverage from the Israeli newspaper Yedioth Ahronoth in exchange for cutting the circulation of a rival paper, Israel Hayom. The police recommended charges against several people close to Netanyahu in November for a third case, involving bribery to procure Israel's purchase of submarines from the ThyssenKrupp, but Netanyahu himself was not implicated. In December, charges against Netanyahu were recommended in the fourth case, alleging that he had advanced favorable regulatory policies for Bezek, a telecommunications company, in exchange for positive media coverage in its controlling shareholders' news outlet. The Attorney General promised to examine the 3 cases in which Netanyahu was implicated together and decide whether to charge him. Netanyahu's political allies largely stuck by him as he denied the allegations and refused to step down, but he soon lost support from his coalition partners amid a series of policy disagreements. A truce with Hamas in November, at the recommendation of the country's defense establishment after the most intense fighting between Israel and the group in years, prompted the resignation of Avigdor Lieberman from his post as defense minister and the withdrawal of his Yisrael Beiteinu party from the coalition, leaving the coalition with a bare minimum of 61 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. At the end of December, a deadline loomed to renew controversial Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, conscription exemptions and prompted disagreements among Netanyahu's remaining coalition partners. The Knesset was dissolved, and early elections were set for April 2019. For the first time in Israeli history, 3 sets of elections were held before a new government could be formed, although this appeared to be due to waning political support for Netanyahu's policies rather than any controversy surrounding his corruption charges. On February 28, less than 6 weeks before the elections, Israel's Attorney General announced that he would pursue the recommended charges against Netanyahu for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, subject to a hearing. His party performed well in the elections despite the charges, and it appeared that he had won a 5th term as prime minister. But coalition negotiations remained at an impasse because his potential coalition partners could not come to an agreement on Haredi conscription. New elections were held in September with similar results, and again no coalition could be formed. The third set of elections was held in March 2020, just before the scheduled start of his trial. The results saw significant gains by Likud, bolstered by an effective get-out-the-vote campaign, but Netanyahu still fell short of enough support to form a coalition. With the backing of the Joint List, a party representing the interests of Palestinian citizens of Israel, Benny Gantz, a retired army general, received the mandate to form a government. As the COVID-19 pandemic took hold of the country, however, Gantz agreed to form an emergency unity government under Netanyahu's premiership, signing a power-sharing deal on April 20 that would hand the office over to Gantz after 18 months. But the emergency unity government, plagued by infighting and criticized for its handling of the COVID-19 crisis, was short-lived. Amid his controversial management of the lockdowns and the economy, and with his corruption trial finally underway, Netanyahu's popularity plummeted even as the United States secured agreements from several Arab countries to normalize ties with Israel, see Abraham Accords. At the end of 2020, the emergency unity government remained unable to pass an annual budget for 2021, leading to the dissolution of the Knesset. A new round of elections was held in March 2021, and, despite a highly successful COVID-19 vaccination drive in early 2021, Netanyahu and his allies again fell short of a majority of Knesset seats. In June, Likud announced the formation of a broad coalition with Naftali Bennett as prime minister, auguring the end of Netanyahu's second stint as prime minister. Electoral comeback in 2022 and reliance on the far right. Netanyahu's corruption trial was derailed in early 2022 when it was reported that the police had used Pegasus spyware to hack the cell phones of some of the trial's witnesses. The revelation caused delays in testimony and damaged the trial's integrity in the eyes of the public. In May, Netanyahu's defense team demonstrated that a key meeting alleged by the prosecution could not have taken place on the date claimed in the indictment, casting further doubt on the strength of their case in the Bezek allegations. Meanwhile, as leader of the largest party in the opposition, Netanyahu began taking an aggressive approach toward the ruling coalition. After a senior member of the coalition defected to the opposition in April, splitting the Knesset 60-60, Netanyahu encouraged additional defections in an effort to bring down Bennett's government. In June, he directed his party to vote against the renewal of an emergency regulation, in place since 1967, that allowed Israeli settlements in the West Bank to be governed by civil rather than military administration. The renewal was voted down and the regulation's expiration date threatened to sow chaos in the legal system. The move forced Bennett to call for the Knesset's dissolution, which would allow emergency regulations to be extended until new elections could lead to formation of a government. When elections were held in November, voter turnout was the highest Israel had seen since 1999, and the right-wing bloc saw its greatest performance since 2015. Netanyahu was returned to office with a controversial coalition that included far-right ministers, most notably Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, in pivotal posts. The appointment of one cabinet minister was revoked by the High Court of Justice because he was serving a suspended sentence. The intervention of the High Court added impetus to the coalition's controversial plans to bring the judiciary under legislative oversight, with potential implications for Netanyahu's corruption trial, by amending the country's basic laws. Attempts to enact such reforms in 2023 led to unprecedented strikes and protests by many Israelis, including thousands of army reservists, concerned over the separation of powers. In August, senior military officials warned lawmakers that the readiness of the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, for war had begun to weaken. Israel-Hamas war. On October 7, 2023, Israel suffered its deadliest day since its independence when Hamas launched a coordinated land, sea, and air assault. About 1,200 Israelis were killed and about 240 others were taken hostage. The attack, which appeared to have extensive planning, caught the Israeli defense establishment off guard, leading many Israelis to question the government's lack of preparedness. As Israel began conducting air strikes against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Netanyahu brought Gantz from the opposition into his emergency war cabinet, both bolstering the military expertise of Netanyahu's government and reducing his reliance on his far-right ministers in wartime decision-making. A ground invasion began weeks later, bringing the Israel-Hamas war into full swing. Netanyahu faced severe criticism for his handling of the situation. He bore the brunt of the blame not only for the polarized atmosphere that preceded the October 7 attacks but also for the tremendous strain placed on Israelis by the hostage crisis, the displacement of Israelis near the border with the Gaza Strip, and the mobilization of a large portion of Israel's working-age population for war. The families of the hostages in particular expressed frustration over Netanyahu's reluctance to negotiate a ceasefire to secure the hostages' release, and members of the war cabinet publicly chastised Netanyahu for aiming to bring about a total victory and for his delay in articulating a vision for the day after the war. Support for Netanyahu and his Likud party plummeted in the polls, falling in October to a distant second behind Gantz and his National Unity Party and remaining low into 2024. Although Netanyahu initially drew international support to respond to the October 7 attacks, he grew increasingly isolated as the humanitarian toll in the Gaza Strip mounted. In March 2024 he faced an unusually public rift with U.S. press. Joe Biden and U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer over an impending offensive in the city of Rafah, one of the only areas in the Gaza Strip that had remained unscathed by the ground invasion and where most of the population was taking shelter. The offensive went forward in May. By late May the pressure on Netanyahu mounted. Protests in Tel Aviv were growing in scale and Gantz, who laid out his vision for a post-war Gaza Strip, threatened to resign from the war cabinet by early June if Netanyahu did not present an exit strategy. On May 20 the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor announced he would seek arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as Hamas leaders Yahya Sinwar, Ismail Haniyeh and Mohammed Diaf, for war crimes and crimes against humanity, a move Netanyahu and others denounced for drawing equivalence between the actions of Israel and those of Hamas. Nonetheless, public support for Netanyahu rose slightly as support for Gantz slumped. Benjamin Netanyahu was first elected Prime Minister of Israel on May 29, 1996, by a margin of about 1% over Shimon Peres. Netanyahu became the youngest person ever to serve as Israel's prime minister when he formed a government on June 18, 1996. Benjamin Netanyahu was born in 1949 in Tel Aviv and grew up in Jerusalem. His high school years were spent in the United States, where his father, the historian Benzion Netanyahu, taught and conducted historical research. Returning to Israel in 1967, Mr. Netanyahu enlisted in the IDF and served in an elite unit of the Israeli army, Sayeret Matkal. He took part in several operations, including the rescue of hostages in a hijacked Sabena airplane in 1972. In the same year, he was cited for outstanding operational command by General Mordecai Ger, Chief of Israel's Northern Command. After his discharge from the IDF in 1972, Mr. Netanyahu served in the Yom Kippur War of 1973 and was promoted after the war to the rank of captain in the reserves. Mr. Netanyahu received a Bachelor's of Science degree in architecture and a Master of Science in Business Management from MIT. He also studied political science at MIT and at Harvard University. Between 1976 and 1982 Mr. Netanyahu worked in the private sector, first with the Boston Consulting Group, an international business consultancy, and then as a member of senior management position of RIM Industries in Jerusalem. In 1979 and 1984 Mr. Netanyahu organized two international conferences that emphasized the need to fight terror groups and the regime supporting them. U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz has written that Mr. Netanyahu's public advocacy and books had a decisive influence in shaping American policy toward fighting terrorism. In 1982, Mr. Netanyahu was appointed Deputy Chief of Mission at the Israeli Embassy in Washington, D.C. From 1984 to 1988, he served as Israel's ambassador to the UN, and became renowned for championing Israel's cause in the international arena. He successfully led the effort to declassify the United Nations archives on war crimes committed by Nazi Germany. Returning to Israel in 1988, Mr. Netanyahu was elected to the Knesset on the Likud party list and was appointed Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. During the Gulf War he served as Israel's principal spokesman in the international media. In 1991 he participated in the Israeli delegation to the Madrid Peace Conference and in the first strategic cooperation talks between Israel and the United States. In 1993 Mr. Netanyahu was elected Likud party chairman and served as leader of the opposition until being elected Prime Minister of Israel in 1996. During his first term as Prime Minister, the number of terror attacks against Israel decreased dramatically. Mr. Netanyahu also advanced the peace process with the Palestinians, signing both the Hebron and Y Accords. Mr. Netanyahu liberalized foreign currency regulations, accelerated privatization of government-owned companies and reduced the budget deficit. During his term in office, foreign investment reached record highs. In 2002, after 3 years in the private sector, Mr. Netanyahu returned to politics, first as Minister of Foreign Affairs and then as Minister of Finance. He enacted sweeping economic reforms that helped pull Israel out of a deep recession and place it on a path of long-term growth. He controlled government spending, reformed the welfare system, cut tax rates, privatized major state-owned industries, reformed the pension and welfare systems and enacted a major capital market reform. Following these reforms, Israel enjoyed robust growth, lower unemployment, and rapidly declining debt levels. Mr. Netanyahu has written and edited the following books that appeared in Hebrew and English, with some also translated into Chinese, Russian, French, Arabic, Japanese and other languages. Self-Portrait of a Hero, The Letters of Jonathan Netanyahu, 1963–1976, co-editor, with Ido Netanyahu, 1978. International Terrorism, Challenge and Response, editor, 1979. Terrorism, How the West Can Win, editor, 1987. A Place Among the Nations, Israel and the World, 1992. Fighting Terrorism, How Democracies Can Defeat Domestic and International Terrorism, 1996. Sarah Netanyahu was born in November 1958 in the northern Israeli town of Tivun, near Haifa. She is married to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and is the mother of Yair, 22, who after completing his military service in the IDF spokesman unit is now a student at the Hebrew University, and Avner, 19, who deferred his military service for a year to volunteer for the Israel Scouts movement's educational and cultural activities helping challenged youths. Avner was Israel's 2010 Bible Quiz champion and the second runner-up in the 2010 International Bible Quiz. Sarah is the daughter of the late Chava and Shmuel Ben-Artzi, a poet and writer, who was one of Israel's renowned veteran teachers and educators. She is a sister to Matanya, a professor of mathematics, Hagi, a doctor of philosophy, and Amatzia, a high-tech entrepreneur, all of whom were Israel Bible Quiz champions. She is an expert child psychologist at the Jerusalem Municipality Psychological Service. Sarah Netanyahu is the first Israeli Prime Minister's wife who, in addition to her public duties, continues to work in her profession as an expert child psychologist in the civil service. She is a full-time mother to her 2 boys. In 2009, Mr. Netanyahu was elected Prime Minister for the second time. He established a national unity government and forged a consensus within Israel on peace with the Palestinians by calling for a demilitarized Palestinian state that recognizes the Jewish state. He continued to overhaul Israel's economy by passing land reform, making major investments in the country's roads and railways and streamlining the country's planning and zoning bureaucracy. He enacted sweeping reforms in Israel's educational system, from higher education to free education from the age of 3. Thank you for watching this video.